How do we take the pulse of an entire country's economy? It seems like an impossibly complex task, right? But for decades, the go-to metric has been something called gross domestic product, or GDP. In this explainer, we'll unpack exactly what GDP is, how it's measured, and what it does. And perhaps even more importantly, what it doesn't tell us about the health of an economy.
So here's our roadmap. We'll start with the core concept. What exactly is GDP? Then we'll look at the 3 different ways economists can calculate it. We're going to do a deep dive into the most common approach, which is the expenditure method, before clarifying some really important things that get excluded from GDP. And finally, we'll pull it all together.
All right, let's start with the big question. Whenever you hear that a country's economy has grown by, say, 2%, what are they actually measuring? Well, they're measuring the change in its gross domestic product.
Okay, here is the formal definition. GDP is the total market value of all final goods and services produced within an economy in a given time period. That's usually a year or sometimes a quarter. Now, every single part of that definition is important. We're talking about the total value, so it's a monetary figure. It's about what's produced inside a country's borders, and it has a time limit. But that word final, that one is especially crucial.
This right here is why that word final matters so much. We have to avoid a major statistical trap called double counting. Think about it. If we counted the value of the steel that goes into a car, and then we also counted the full value of the finished car, we'd be counting the steel twice. To prevent that, GDP only counts the final product, in this case, the car that's sold to the consumer. The value of all the intermediate parts, like the steel, is already captured in that final price.
So, we know what we're trying to measure. The next logical question is, how do we actually do it? Well, it turns out there are 3 different ways to approach the calculation. And they're all connected to this idea of the circular flow of the economy, where one person's spending becomes another person's income.
And here are the 3 approaches: the income method, the output method, and the expenditure method. You can think of them as looking at the exact same economic pie, but from 3 different angles: what is earned, what is made, and what is spent. And, in theory, all 3 should give you the exact same final number.
So let's look at the first one. The output method is probably the most direct way of thinking about it. It tries to add up the value of absolutely everything produced in the economy, sector by sector. And to get around that double counting problem we just talked about, it calculates the value added at each stage of production. So for example, it would count the value a furniture maker adds to a piece of wood, not the total price of the chair plus the price of the wood.
But you can probably imagine, trying to survey every single firm in an entire country is incredibly difficult. This headline is a fantastic illustration of that challenge. Back in 2014, Nigeria's GDP figure literally jumped by 89% overnight. And why? Simply because they updated their survey methods to include new industries like telecommunications and their film industry, Nollywood. It just goes to show you how much can be missed when you rely only on the output approach.
Okay, the second perspective is the income method. Instead of looking at what's made, this approach looks at what's earned. It sums up all the income generated from producing things. This includes all the wages paid to workers, the rent earned by property owners, the interest paid on capital, and the profits earned by businesses. It's basically the total income generated by producing a country's entire output. And that brings us to the most commonly cited and, you could argue, the most useful method for economic analysis, the expenditure method. This is the one we're going to take a closer look at.
The logic here is pretty simple. If something was produced and it generated income, then somebody somewhere must have bought it. So by measuring the total spending on all those final goods and services, we should get to the exact same GDP figure. This approach is really useful because it breaks down the economy by who is doing the spending.
The expenditure approach has 4 key components. First, there's C for consumption. That's all the spending by households like you and me. Then we have G for government spending on public goods and services. I stands for investment, which is spending by firms on things like machinery and factories. And finally, we have XM, which stands for net exports. That's just the value of a country's exports minus the value of its imports.
And this gives us probably the most famous equation in macroeconomics. GDP equals C plus G plus I plus net exports. Understanding these components is absolutely crucial because policymakers watch them like a hawk. If C, consumption, starts to fall during a recession, a government might decide to increase G, its own spending, to help stimulate the economy. It really is the foundational formula for analyzing economic activity.
So what does this formula actually look like in the real world? Well, this slide shows a pretty typical breakdown for the US economy. As you can see, consumption or household spending is by far the biggest piece of the pie. Government spending and investment are also very significant. And net exports for the US are often a small negative number because it tends to import more goods and services than it exports.
Okay, now that we've seen what makes up GDP, it's just as important to understand what's left out. There are a couple of common points of confusion here that we really need to clear up.
First up, we have something called transfer payments. This includes things like unemployment benefits, student grants, or state pensions. Now, while this is technically government spending, it does not get included in the G of our GDP formula. And why is that? Because the money is simply being transferred from one group of people to another, without any new good or service being produced in exchange. It's not a payment for current production.
Another really common misconception is about imports. When you see that M is subtracted in the formula, it's so easy to think that imports are somehow bad for the economy. But that's not what's happening at all. Remember, the C, G, and I components all include spending on imported goods. We have to subtract M simply to remove that foreign-produced spending from the calculation, because GDP is a measure of domestic production. It's purely an accounting adjustment, not an economic judgment.
Okay, let's bring all these threads together now. We've defined what GDP is, and we've explored the three different lenses: output, income, and expenditure that we can use to view it.
This really gets to the core takeaway of our whole discussion. The value of what a country produces, well, that has to equal the income earned from producing it, and that, in turn, must also equal the amount spent to buy it. Production, income, and expenditure are simply three sides of the very same economic coin.
But that brings us to our final thought. While these three methods should match in a perfect world, in practice, they never do. There are always what we call statistical discrepancies. So that leaves us with a question to think about. Given the immense complexity of a modern economy, what are some of the real-world challenges in collecting data that prevent these three measures from ever lining up perfectly?